The receptionist's voice was a flat monotone, an industrial smile firmly fixed on his lips as he slid the worn passport across the marble counter, refusing the check-in request of the man holding his sleeping young daughter in the cold, rainy night. The Perry Grand Hotel sat on the corner of the city's most expensive block, the way a crown sits on a head that has grown used to the weight of it. The hotel's porte-cochere was still a good 5 car lengths away from Hudson's taxi. A group of intoxicated guests was stumbling out of a long, white limousine, looking like the remnants of a wedding party. The hotel staff was struggling to assist them, but a man and a woman in the group seemed blind drunk, outright refusing to step out of the car and causing a chaotic scene. The driver turned around without much sympathy in his voice. "Traffic's locked up, buddy. You want to sit while they clear this out, or you want out here?" Hudson looked down at Matilda, 7 years old, and folded against his chest in the particular boneless way that only exhausted children manage. Her arms looped loosely around his neck, and he made the decision the way he made most decisions. That involved her comfort weighed against his own, quickly and without complaint. He paid the fare, opened the door, and stepped out. The driver grabbed the suitcase from the trunk, handed it to Hudson, and immediately retreated into the car, muttering something unintelligible. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind hit, accompanied by a sudden downpour, the way summer storms often do in this part of the country. With no cover, Hudson quickly pulled the hood of Matilda's coat up to shield her head and arched his back into a kind of makeshift roof to protect his daughter as much as possible. Matilda stirred but did not wake, her head tucking deeper into the crook of his neck, the way a small animal burrows further into shelter rather than further out of it. Hudson half walked, half ran the 50 feet of open pavement between the curb and the revolving doors, dragging a small-wheeled suitcase behind him that rattled with a dry, hollow clatter. A bellman in a bright red uniform coat with gold epaulets reached them before the doors had finished turning. He was young, efficient, and trained well enough that his face did not change even as his eyes dropped, for less than a second, to the suitcase, a canvas thing with a broken zipper pull and frayed corners. That half-second was the only tell. "Sir, my apologies for the inconvenience. Let me take that for you." He took the suitcase, clipped a paper tag to the handle, tore the stub free, and handed it to Hudson before wheeling the bag off toward the holding area. Hudson exhaled once, the small private relief of a burden handed off, and shifted Matilda higher on his hip as he crossed the lobby floor. The room opened around him the way these lobbies are built to open, soaring, marble-veined, lit from somewhere unseen, the air carrying the deep scent of black tea, cedarwood, and Sicilian bergamot. The elegant luxury of fresh white peonies constantly replaced, combined with the subtle glow of chandeliers and wall sconces to make the entire scene spectacular. Hudson's boots squeaked against the stone floor. He approached the front desk and read the small brass nameplate before he read anything else, an old habit, and gave the clerk behind it his full name. Hudson Perry. "I have a reservation, room 805. It was not, on its face, an unusual request. Guests asked for specific rooms all the time, for the view, for the floor, for a superstition about numbers. But room 805 was not a room Hudson wanted to sleep in at all. In truth, booking room 805 was nothing more than a cheap pass to bypass the hotel's secure elevator system. The real room Hudson had to enter tonight at all costs was Suite 1901, the VIP suite on the top floor, rumored to be permanently sealed. Once he got the key card for 805, he would unlock that forbidden door himself. Hudson was silently mulling over his plan while waiting for the receptionist to process his check-in. Nolan stood behind the grand marble counter. He was 24, wearing a charcoal suit tailored to sit perfectly across the shoulders, his posture upright and practiced. A copper gold name tag was pinned to his chest. His fingers moved across the keyboard, and for a fraction of a second, the screen returned something that made him pause. His eyes flicked up from the monitor to the man in front of him, and back down again, the way a person double-checks a number that does not match what they expected to see. Then his gaze traveled the rest of the way, from wet hair plastered to a tired forehead, down a small canvas travel bag hanging crossbody, slung low on one hip and bulging with the disorganized cargo of a young child's belongings, refusing to zip. Whatever hesitation the screen had produced in him lasted exactly as long as it took him to finish that inventory, and no longer. "Sir, I believe there's been some confusion with your booking," Nolan said, sliding the passport back across the marble with 2 fingers, the way a man returns something he does not particularly want to have touched. His voice stayed level, almost gentle, the practiced courtesy of someone trained never to raise his tone even while delivering an insult. "We're fully booked this evening. There are several hotels 2 streets over that should be able to accommodate you." Hudson felt Matilda shift against him. Still asleep, still trusting the shape of the night to work itself out the way it always somehow did. He kept his own voice low, unhurried. The register of a man trying not to wake his daughter rather than a man defending himself. "There must be a mix-up. We flew in late, we were caught in that rain just now. I'd appreciate it if you check the system again." He was not asking for anything beyond what any tired father would ask for. He only wanted the clerk to look once more, carefully, the way the numbers on the screen had already tried to tell him to. But Nolan had already decided everything he needed to know, and to him, in that gleaming lobby full of guests who smelled of good perfume and old money, the man standing in front of him was not a puzzle to solve. He was simply someone who did not belong here. A conclusion so complete in Nolan's mind that no correction to the screen, however loud, would have reached him now. He offered the same practiced smile he gave every difficult guest, the one that cost him nothing and gave away even less, and folded his hands neatly on the counter to wait for Hudson to leave. Hudson looked at Nolan. The silence between them stretched out, filling the space beneath the soaring ceilings. He looked at Nolan, observing the perfect knot of the silk tie, the slight tilt of his chin, the absolute certainty in his eyes. Nolan was enforcing a boundary. He was looking right through a man holding a shivering child, seeing nothing but a stain in his perfect environment. Hudson thought of the cold black metal card in his pocket. It might be quicker to resolve the situation this way. He felt the cold water seeping through his socks. He felt the steady rhythm of his daughter's breath against his chest. Today was the 3-year anniversary of the morning Lana stopped breathing in a hospital bed that looked exactly like 1,000 other beds, where illness made no distinction between rich and poor. Hudson had promised his wife he would protect their daughter's peace, that he would let her grow up without bearing a suffocating weight or getting caught in chaotic, busy cycles. He would not commemorate this day by turning the lobby into a theater of vengeance, waking Matilda to the sound of men shouting and apologizing. He decided he should act normally. Nolan did not break eye contact as he reached for the brass-trimmed phone resting on the marble counter. He moved with the precise, unhurried grace of someone who knew the building's machinery was specifically designed to insulate him from discomfort. He pressed a single button on the console, waiting exactly 2 seconds to connect. "Security," he said, his voice dropping to a register of polite urgency. "We have a vagrant at the front desk causing a disturbance. Please send an escort to the lobby." This was, for Nolan, the cleanest kind of power there was. The kind that never required him to raise his voice or admit to a single personal opinion, because the policy did the work for him. He had learned over 2 years behind this counter that a hotel's rules were a wall a man could stand behind indefinitely, and that no one ever thought to ask what was actually written on the other side of it. He straightened his cuffs and waited, the picture of a man who had done nothing at all. 20 yards away, near the base of the grand staircase, Reagan swept a microfiber cloth over the already gleaming surface of a brass handrail. She was 61 years old, 4 hours into a 10-hour shift, and her knees ached with a familiar, deep throb that no over-the-counter medication could ever fully suppress. She watched the exchange at the front desk, the way a pedestrian watches a heavy truck skidding on black ice, knowing exactly what the crash would sound like, and knowing she was entirely powerless to stop it. She saw the tired slump of the man's coat, the way he shifted his stance to shield the sleeping child's head from the ambient noise of the room. She knew Nolan. She had watched him work through shifts, driving away those who did not meet his visual standard of wealth while fawning over men wearing $10,000 watches. Reagan gripped her cloth tighter. She needed this job. Her husband Richard had been in the cardiac ward for 11 days, and the hospital billing department had started leaving daily voicemails. She ducked her head and scrubbed the brass until her knuckles turned white, silently begging the man at the counter to turn around and walk away before things got worse. 2 security officers emerged from the wood-paneled hallway behind the guest services station. They wore dark suits tailored rather than uniform, designed to look like high-end protection rather than bouncers, but their posture carried the unmistakable, heavy readiness of men paid to handle physical problems quietly. They flanked Hudson, stopping just close enough to violate the boundaries of personal space. "Sir," the taller officer said, raising a hand to hover inches from Hudson's elbow, "we need you to vacate this area." "Do not touch me," Hudson said softly. It wasn't a shout, but the absolute absence of hesitation in his voice made the guard's hand drop instinctively. Hudson pivoted smoothly, keeping his body between the guards and his daughter. He stepped away from the counter, walking back across the vast expanse of the lobby toward the entrance, leaving faint wet footprints on the stone. He stopped at the luggage staging area. The young bellman in the bright red coat looked at him, confused as Hudson held out his receipt. "I'm not checking in," Hudson said. "I need my bag back." The bellman took the receipt and unclipped the paper tag, lifting the worn canvas suitcase off the gleaming brass luggage cart and set it down in front of Hudson without a word. The small courtesy of a man who understood in a way his colleague at the front desk did not. That dignity cost nothing to extend and everything to withhold. Hudson hooked his fingers around the plastic handle. He walked toward the heavy glass doors, stepping out of the warm, seductively scented atmosphere with its sophisticated air, provided by the signature essential oils. Hudson returned to the wet, freezing cold of the night outside. Just behind him, the cheap plastic wheels of the suitcase rattled loudly against the perfect Italian marble. In the expensive, hushed silence of the lobby, this rhythmic noise echoed up to the vaulted ceiling, striking the stone over and over again, like a large clock counting down the final seconds before an alarm was set to ring. The limousine that had claimed the porte cochere was gone, leaving the 90-foot expanse of the overhang empty, save for the dim glow of recessed lighting. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees, and the wind snaked through the stone columns, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and freezing exhaust. Hudson stood near the outer edge of the overhang, shifting his stance to block the draft. Matilda stirred against his chest. She blinked, her eyelashes heavy with mist, and looked back toward the gleaming glass doors they had just exited. She wriggled against him, looking up with the slow, heavy-lidded confusion of a child waking from interrupted sleep. "Aren't we going inside, Dad?" "Not just yet, sweetheart," Hudson said, keeping his voice even. He let out a breath he had been holding since the lobby, long and controlled, letting go of the suitcase handle to reach for his phone with his free hand. His fingers had gone stiff and slow with the cold, and the phone slipped just as it cleared his pocket, landing with a soft, flat sound against the carpeted runner beneath the overhang. Reagan was there before he'd finished bending toward it. She was still pushing her heavy brass utility cart through the side service doors to clean the exterior revolving glass, a maintenance task dictated by the operating manual every 4 hours regardless of the weather, a job that kept her moving without ever really taking her anywhere. She knelt, retrieved the phone, and wiped the screen clean against the hem of her uniform apron before pressing it back into Hudson's free hand. A gesture small and complete, the way a person returns a thing they have decided, without being asked, is worth taking care of. "Thank you," Hudson said, taking the phone back from Reagan's hand. Matilda wriggled to be set down, and Hudson carefully lowered her to her feet. She looked up at Reagan with the wide, unguarded directness that only very young children still permit themselves in front of strangers, and said, simply, "Thank you." Reagan looked at her. The deep lines around the older woman's eyes softened, shifting her expression from professional invisibility to a quiet, human sorrow. She glanced behind her, checking the sight lines through the lobby windows to make sure no one was watching, believing, as anyone would, that the soaked father was simply preparing to hunt the block for another hotel with a vacancy. She stepped a half-pace closer, dropping her voice beneath the sound of the rain. "It's cold out here, and cab fares this time of night are close to robbery. I live 3 blocks from here. It's just a small place, 1 bedroom, and the radiator rattles. But the sofa is dry and I have a clean wool blanket. It's no place for a gentleman, but it'll keep the little one from freezing until morning." Her eyes moved to Matilda as she said it. She was risking immediate termination for fraternizing with a man security had just thrown out, simply because her conscience could not bear the sight of a freezing child on the pavement. Hudson looked at the older woman in her damp uniform, and then he looked through the spotless glass doors at the brilliantly pristine chandelier hanging in the center of the lobby. In the freezing draft of the driveway, a working-class woman with nothing was offering everything she had, stirring an indescribable wave of emotion within him. He opened his mouth to reply, intending to politely decline the offer and finally make the phone call that would shatter the hierarchy of the lobby, but a mechanical hiss interrupted him. The heavy automatic doors behind Reagan slid open, pulling a rush of warm, subtly scented air out into the damp, freezing driveway. Nolan stepped through the threshold. His shift was over. He had traded his charcoal suit jacket for a camel-hair topcoat, perfectly buttoned against the cold. He stood at the curb with one arm raised, flagging down a cab for himself the way a man flags down the ordinary conveniences of a life he considers entirely earned. He glanced sideways out of habit more than curiosity, and what he saw stopped his arm mid-wave. Reagan, still talking to the man from the front desk. The rejected one. Nolan's jaw tightened. The quiet satisfaction he had felt at the front desk immediately curdled into a sharp, managerial disgust. He strode toward them, his leather-soled shoes clicking sharply against the wet concrete, moving with the brisk, authoritative stride of a man who owned the space simply because he dressed for it. He didn't slow down as he reached the cart. He lifted his foot and drove his polished toe into the brass wheel frame the way a man kicks a stray dog off a porch. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Reagan?" Nolan asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the cutting, precise frequency of absolute authority. "The hotel doesn't pay you to socialize with vagrants on the front drive. You look like an absolute mess." Reagan recoiled, her shoulders dropping instinctively. She folded in on herself, clasping her red, calloused hands together over her apron, a physical capitulation under the sudden weight of the attack. "Mr. Nolan, I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking over the sound of the rain. "The little one was freezing, and I just thought—" "You are not supposed to think," Nolan interrupted, adjusting the lapels of his topcoat. He looked at her the way a homeowner looks at a bug that has managed to crawl onto the dining table. "Your job is to polish glass. I suggest you drag this garbage back into the service hallway. Tomorrow, I will report your situation to the director of housekeeping. I don't believe you'll be keeping your shift tomorrow. We do not tolerate staff fraternizing with transients." Reagan's breath hitched in her chest. She leaned forward slightly, reaching out a hand as if to physically stop the words from taking effect. "Please," she whispered, panic rising to the surface. "Richard is in the hospital. I need this job. I won't say another word, I promise you. Just please don't file that report." Nolan smiled, a thin, flat line that barely moved his cheeks. He found her desperation offensive, a messy display of weakness that did not belong in his pristine environment. "Clean up your mess, Reagan," he said. He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence entirely, and started walking toward his waiting car. The sudden violence of the kick and the sharp, cruel tone of the exchange had jolted Matilda completely awake. She pressed her face against her father's thigh, her eyes darting between the shrinking woman and the man walking away from her. And then she let out a small, terrified sob. Hudson immediately dropped to one knee and gathered her against his chest. And it was there, holding his daughter's shaking shoulders while a good woman wept beside him over a threat that cost Nolan nothing to make, that the careful, deliberate silence Hudson had maintained for the past 3 years finally gave way. He had spent all this time avoiding his own name the way a man avoids a room he cannot bear to enter, telling himself it was for Matilda's sake, so that her life could stay ordinary, so that no one would ever look at his daughter and see only the weight of what her father owned. That had always felt, to him, like the right kind of quiet. But he understood now, kneeling on wet pavement with his daughter's tears falling on his neck. There was a difference between staying quiet to protect a child and staying quiet while a man like Nolan was allowed to go on doing exactly this, to whoever crossed his path next, forever, unchecked. The master key sat where it had sat all evening, tucked into the inside pocket of his still damp coat. A small black card he had not needed to reach for once tonight until now. It would not stay there much longer. Hudson rose to his feet, gripping Matilda's hand tightly in one of his. He spoke loudly just as Nolan laid his hand on the taxi door handle. "Aren't you curious to see how the manager will react when he hears about this?" Nolan spun around, a flash of astonishment crossing his shiny, handsome face. Then the astonishment shifted into an amused expression, though he couldn't laugh too overtly because he was in front of the Perry Hotel, the most luxurious place in the city. Hudson dialed the number and brought the phone to his ear, his eyes still glaring at Nolan. When he spoke, something in his voice made two guests passing nearby under the overhang straighten without quite understanding why. The way people straighten in the presence of an authority they haven't yet identified but have already recognized somewhere beneath conscious thought. "This is Hudson Perry," he said, and did not raise his voice at all to say it. "I need the night manager in the lobby." Immediately, Nolan froze for exactly half a second, the same half second the front desk screen had given him an hour earlier, and dismissed it just as quickly. Then he laughed, a short, dry, disbelieving sound. He glared straight at Hudson. "That's a decent performance, old man. You really think a fake phone call and a self-important tone are going to scare me? Save it." He shook his head, the picture of a man restoring order to a world that had briefly, absurdly, threatened to tilt. "Go get some help." He reached again for the handle. His fingers had not yet closed around it when the glass doors behind him were thrown open hard enough to shudder against their own frames, and David came barreling through them at a dead run. David was the hotel's night manager, and in the ordinary architecture of any given evening, he was the most powerful person on the premises after 11 o'clock p.m. A man whose word could comp a suite, override a booking, or end a career, all without consulting anyone above him until morning. None of that showed on him now. David's tie hung crooked, sweat darkened the collar of his shirt at both temples, and his breath came in short, ragged pulls, the remnants of a dead sprint down 2 flights of stairs rather than waiting for an elevator. He dashed out into the freezing rain, his eyes scanning the driveway in absolute panic, and skidded to a halt directly in front of Hudson, his posture rigid with fear, his face pale as he nervously swiped the sweat from his temple. Nolan smiled, quickly stepping forward to intercept his superior, eager to control the narrative. "David, sir, everything is under control. We just had a vagrant causing a—" David did not let him finish his sentence. He didn't even bother looking in Nolan's face. He simply swung his left arm out and shoved the immaculately dressed receptionist aside with a brutal, thoughtless force, walking through the young man the way someone walks through a spiderweb in the dark. "Mr. Perry," David said, his voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the wind. "Welcome back, sir. I am so deeply sorry for this delay." The driveway fell into total silence, save for the rhythmic tapping of the storm against the glass canopy. Nolan's leather bag slipped from his fingers and hit the whetstone with a heavy, wet smack. His face was the color of old chalk. He looked at the soaked, exhausted man he had turned away less than an hour ago, and then at his own manager standing subserviently before him. The pieces of the evening reassembled themselves in Nolan's mind, snapping together with the devastating precision of a steel trap closing shut. The name on the screen. The refusal to argue. The quiet confidence he had misinterpreted as the delusion of a homeless man. The man he had just thrown out into the freezing rain was not a coincidence of names. He owned every marble tile beneath all of their feet. In the corner near the abandoned cleaning cart, Reagan still stood trembling, her hands pressed together, utterly unable to make sense of what she was watching unfold in front of her. Matilda, now gathered up in her father's arms, had gone quiet, her tear-streaked face turning to watch the grown man standing so fearfully rigid in front of her father with an expression of pure, uncomplicated confusion. Hudson did not raise his voice. He had not raised it once all evening, and he did not intend to start now, in front of his daughter, on this night of all nights. He simply stepped past David, closing the distance to Nolan himself, and looked down at him with a stillness that was, in its own way, far more terrifying than any shout could have been. "You enforce the regulations very well, Nolan," Hudson said, his voice low, calm, and incredibly heavy. "But you have forgotten the core of the industry you work in. We provide shelter. We do not use our policies to humiliate the vulnerable." Hudson looked into the young man's wide, terrified eyes for a long second, allowing the absolute finality of the moment to settle into the cold air. Then, he slightly turned his head toward the manager. "Suspend him," Hudson said. "Immediately." He didn't wait for an acknowledgement. He adjusted his hold on Matilda in his arms, stepped past the paralyzed receptionist, and walked straight through the open glass doors, carrying his daughter back into the warmth of the building he had built. Morning came in the pale, uncertain way it does after a night of rain, sunlight filtering thin and diffuse through a sky that had not fully decided to clear. Hudson stood before the heavy wooden door of Suite 1901 with a black master key in his hand and a stillness in his chest that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before plunging into cold water. He had spent the last 3 years running from the geography of this room. He had convinced himself that if he just kept his daughter in the quiet suburbs, surrounded by ordinary houses and green lawns, he could somehow protect her from the massive, sterile monument he had built in exchange for her mother's healthy years. Lana had never asked for a hotel. She had asked for a small house in a valley where she could feel the earth get under her fingernails and sit on a porch that didn't require a security badge to access. Hudson had believed he could give her that later, after the grand opening, after the board of directors was satisfied, after the empire was secured. He had poured his time into boardrooms and construction sites, while Lana raised Matilda largely alone in a house at the edge of the city, visited on weekends that grew, without either of them really choosing it, further and further apart. By the time the company had finally settled into something steady enough for him to slow down, he prepared this for her instead. A penthouse suite on the top floor of his flagship hotel, floor-to-ceiling glass wrapping around a panoramic view of the city skyline, given to her the way a man offers an apology he has convinced himself is also a gift. And she had lived in it for exactly 58 days before the doctors discovered the illness that no amount of personal wealth could negotiate with. He slid the metal key into the slot. The electronic reader chimed, a short, cheerful sequence of notes that felt entirely out of place in the heavy silence, and the dead bolts retracted with a mechanical click. Hudson pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, carrying Matilda in his arms. The air inside the suite was thick and utterly still, holding a dry temperature characteristic of a climate control system that had been disabled for 36 months. The heavy velvet curtains had been drawn 3 years ago, leaving only a faint streak of morning light cutting across the center of the living room. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam, suspended in the uncirculated air. This space was no longer a luxury penthouse. It was a time capsule, a perfect, undisturbed record of the day the world stopped making sense. In the far corner, a black Steinway piano sat beneath a thin gray layer of dust. On its wooden music stand, 3 pages of hand-drawn sheet music had begun to curl and yellow at the edges, the pencil strokes of Lana's unfinished composition still waiting for the next chord. Near the floor-to-ceiling windows, placed beside a polished teak end table, was a deep, velvet reading chair. The chair where she had liked to sit reading every evening before the light finally failed, and a charcoal gray cashmere shawl lay draped across its back, exactly as she had left it. It maintained the hollow, slouched shape of the shoulders that had worn it, as if she had only just stood up to brew herself a cup of chamomile tea and fully intended to return immediately. Hudson set Matilda down, and she began looking around on her own, her childish memory unable to recall much from when she was barely 3. But from all the old photos of their happy family taken when they first moved here, Matilda seemed to remember every object that had ever appeared in those frames. He walked slowly toward the chair, his boots leaving faint, temporary indentations on the thick pile of the carpet. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the shawl. He pressed the soft wool to his face, closing his eyes, searching for the memory of his wife. Beneath the dust, faint and nearly gone, was the scent of cedar dried over the years, and the faintest trace of vetiver root, no longer a full fragrance but more like the shadow of a scent, faded, mournful, and somehow impossible to fully lose. It was not unlike his grief in that way. Neither of them had ever really gone anywhere. Both had simply worn thin enough to stop announcing their existence, settling instead into something that lived beneath everything else, permanent, in a way that nothing loud ever managed to be. He lowered the fabric. Beneath the reading chair, resting perfectly parallel on the rug, was a pair of fleece bunny slippers. They were a child's size 4. For 3 years, outside the sealed door, his daughter had steadily grown, wearing out shoe after shoe, gradually learning to live a life with the absence of the woman both of them needed. But inside this room, time had simply stopped exactly where it stood when the door was last closed, frozen on a pair of slippers that would never again fit the little girl who was present right now. He walked over to the vanity mirror. He placed his broad hand on the lid of a polished walnut music box, leaving a clear palm print in the dust, and lifted the brass latch. The internal gears clicked, turning slowly after years of rest, and the delicate, mechanical notes of Claire de Lune began to play. The melody filled the large, quiet room, echoing against the cold glass. Matilda touched her tiny fingers to her father's hand. Her eyes moved slowly over the shawl, then down to the small bunny slippers on the rug, taking in the preserved history of a mother she could barely remember. "Mom is still here, isn't she, Dad?" Her voice sounded like a whisper. Hudson's chest seized. The iron restraint he had carried for 3 years, the mute, stoic endurance he had used to shield his daughter and punish himself, finally shattered. Tears spilled over his lower lashes, streaking through the dust on his face and falling softly onto the collar of his coat. He dropped to his knees, pulling his daughter tightly into his embrace, burying his face in her hair. He wept for the time he had lost, and for the simple truth that hiding from the past did not help preserve it. He realized that the only way to keep Lana alive was not to lock the memory of her in a dark room, but to walk out into the world and live with the warmth she had always demanded of him. Matilda reached out her small hand, gently patting her father's shoulder. At 2:15 that afternoon, the Human Resources Director on the second floor received a 1-page directive printed on the chairman's personal, heavy-stock letterhead. It was a directive that violated 40 pages of corporate protocol, bypassing every standard evaluation metric the hotel possessed. At the start of the evening shift, Reagan sat in the leather chair opposite the director's desk. She gripped her hands tightly together, her knuckles white, waiting for the worst possible outcome. She looked down at the floor, terrified of how she would explain her loss of income to the hospital billing department. Instead, the director slid a heavy, laminated folder across the desk. Inside was a contract establishing the position of Senior Quality Supervisor, a role created out of thin air that morning. The contract stipulated that Reagan was no longer responsible for pushing a utility cart. Her sole duty was to inspect the guest rooms on the lower floors to ensure they offered a sense of warmth and hospitality, not just chemical sterility. The position came with a salary 3 times her previous wage, and attached to the following page was a premium lifetime health insurance policy covering both her and her husband. Simultaneously, the company had also approved a plan to purchase the apartment building she was renting, intending to use it as a charitable operation to offer low-cost housing for the disadvantaged and emergency shelter for those arriving in the city in need. The 2 first-floor units were to be knocked through and renovated into a spacious private home for her and her husband. The project would be rolled out over the coming months. Affixed to the corner of the contract was a small yellow square of paper bearing the sharp, precise handwriting of Hudson Perry. "Thank you for keeping the fire burning in this building," the note read. "For the rest of your life, stay warm." Reagan stared at the paper, tears pooling in her deep-set eyes, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't pick up the pen to sign her name. 2 floors below, in the rich, warmly scented expanse of the main lobby, Nolan walked toward the exit. He carried a small cardboard box containing a frosted ceramic coffee mug, a framed hospitality management certificate, and 2 expensive fountain pens. He wore his tailored charcoal suit, but the arrogant posture was gone. The security guards who had rushed to his aid the night before watched him pass without blinking, their expressions completely blank. He pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors, stepping out onto the cold concrete of the porte cochere. He stood on the curb waiting for a taxi, looking back at the gleaming glass and steel of the empire that had just permanently and meticulously revoked his access. Friends, our story comes to a close with Nolan stepping out into the freezing rain, leaving behind the very empire he once thought he belonged to. He used policy as the perfect wall to hide his lack of empathy. But he forgot one crucial thing. No matter what you do for a living, the core of any job in this world is about serving people. On the flip side, Reagan, the housekeeper, had practically nothing to her name but financial struggle and the heavy burden of hospital bills. Yet she was willing to give away everything she had out of pure compassion. Her kindness brought warmth back to a building that had become nothing but a fortress of cold rules. And now, I have a quick question for all of you watching. If you were Reagan on that rainy night, carrying the weight of your family's survival with the very real threat of losing your job staring you in the face, would you have had the courage to reach out and help a stranger? Or have you ever been judged solely by your appearance, just like Hudson was? Let me know your thoughts and share your own stories down in the comments. I'd love to read them and chat with you guys. Before we wrap up this video, I'd like to borrow Mr. Hudson's words to leave you with this final wish. Thank you for keeping the fire burning. For the rest of your life, stay warm. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next story.